of Worship, your source for commentary and discussion on worship, theology, and culture. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.
Well, hello, and welcome to the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones. Thank you for joining me today. I am concluding this four-part series on marriage. This is something that I have been reading about and studying about lately, and so that's why I did this. Something I said at the beginning of this series is, people might ask, well, what would a single man know about being married? Well, more than you think. And then I referenced a man that I know who is now married, but at the time was single, who was one of the best marriage counselors I ever met. And I saw God perform miracles through his ministry. People who were married and having struggles, that they went to him for counseling, and he wasn't married at the time. He was a single man. And but what he did was he clearly told him what the Bible said about marriage. And again, I think some of the issue is that people tend to look at what the Bible says about divorce rather than what it says about marriage. But God has a model. He has a structure that he has ordained. And anytime where you're seeking answers, go to Scripture. So I'm a presuppositionalist. So I believe that everything I believe is presupposed by the idea that all the answers we have are in Scripture. And I believe that's true. And that is, that's not hyperbole. Everything. Any answer we want is derived from Scripture. And so in this four-part series, we have looked at, first of all, the foundation of marriage and discussed divorce a little bit. But then we looked at, starting at Ephesians 5, what the Apostle Paul says about husbands and wives. And today we are going to look at kind of what will complete the circle of the family, children, and that is the submission of children to parents and parents to God. And this is from Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 4. So before I get into it, let me read the text here from Ephesians 6, verses 1 through 4. It says this: "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for it is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." So our text here today concludes Paul's instructions to families. And again, the underlying foundation here is that everything we do is done as to the Lord. And so this section of text dealing with the family, the Apostle Paul gives instructions to children, but he does not negate the responsibility of parents in his instructions, because parents hold great responsibility in the development, and especially the spiritual development, of children. A godly picture of the family includes all parties in the unit, which comprises children. And so while various ideas exist concerning the age Paul had in mind here, suffice it to say that a child may be considered one for whom a parent is responsible morally, ethically, and legally. Could that appear differently between cultures, societies, and contexts? Yes, absolutely. And so each parent needs to determine those for whom they're responsible in this manner and apply this text to those people. So Paul's words in Ephesians 6, 1 through 4 are positioned around obedience and honor with an overarching theme of doing what is right. And the rightness of these attitudes is what constitutes behavior. In other words, Christians obey and honor God because it is right, irrespective of personal feelings or sentiments. Additionally, the God-ordained family structure is dependent on parents and children doing what is right in a broad sense, and that is submitting to God by submitting to one another. A key difference, though, in parental submission and the submission of children is that the role of a child includes obedience to his or her parents. Adults do not necessarily have this charge in every single context, and that's not meant to imply that obedience is sometimes necessary for adults, because it is. I mean, there are times where adults must obey. For example, adults should obey their employers and legal authorities. And so adults don't necessarily have the same context as a child. A child should always obey his or her parents, whereas when the child grows up and becomes a productive adult, obedience is not necessarily in the equation, but honor is. But from this text, there are three truths that can be gleaned concerning children. Number one, the motivation for obedience is the fact that it is right. Number two, honor is primary. It's a primary commandment concerning children toward their parents. And number three, authority brings up, not down. And so these factors should offer a supreme example to families as to how children and parents should interact with one another in a godly manner. So first point here, first truth, the motivation for obedience. It is the simple fact that it is right. Verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Anytime you see the word for, you want to find out why it is there for. So the foundation of obedience here, Paul says, is because it's right. The family is a single unit, and where the family unit breaks down, society breaks down, because the family is the institution which God has enacted to carry his functions and will on the earth. And so the Apostle Paul begins his charge to both parents and children here by focusing on the responsibility of children. And in a rather simple manner, Paul gives children the instruction to obey parents on a single basis, because it is right. As Christians, we need to realize that the overarching reason for doing good is because it's right. And there are some things that we do and we must do just because it is right. Whether we want to or not, we do it because it is right. Morality is of God and his nature and character. Right is who God is, and he is incapable of being anything else. So believers, in imitating Christ, should make decisions based on what is right. Paul offers this foundation to children. Obey because it's right. That's the reason. It's as simple as that. We need to come to the point as Christians where no matter how difficult a decision is, if it is right, that's the one we do. And Paul emphasizes a key provision in obedience to parents when he adds, in the Lord. Obey your parents in the Lord. And so its use here is not because the apostle contemplates a situation where the parental orders might be contrary to the law of Christ. The assumption here is that husbands and wives already live in submission to God and therefore seek their children's best interest. So that's why he adds this phrase, in the Lord, mindful of the fact that all instructions presuppose a situation where all parties submit mutually to God and then to each other. Children are given the order to obey their parents because it is right. And so what is right supersedes any questions, answers, or reasons for obedience. When we doubt whether or not we should do something, is it right? Then do it. If it is not right, then don't do it. It's a simple foundation. Even in circumstances where children are not capable of seeing or understanding the reason obedience to their parents is right. And those who are parents might testify to that and understand that there are things your children cannot see or understand, but they need to do it because you've told them to, and you know why you are telling them to. Christian life is verified by obedience to Jesus Christ. John 14:15, if you love me, you will obey me. And rightness is the foundation of obedience. Parents are to obey and submit to the Lord, and children are to obey and submit to their parents. Paul's instructions to the Ephesians here seeps deep below the surface of submission to an area that acknowledges what is right, to the foundation of the issue. Husbands and wives are to often make decisions based on what is right, irrespective of their desire to do so or not. Godly submission requires this type of thinking and abandonment of selfish desires. And so for children, doing what is right also requires stripping their own desires from decision making and obeying their parents because it is right despite what the erring heart and mind perceives. We can try to justify our decisions all we want. Well, if I just do X or Y, I don't think it's that bad. Isn't that what the serpent was doing with Eve? Well, surely you won't die. I mean, he was justifying it. And that's what we do in some of our decision making. So often we justify it and try to say, well, if I do this, it's not that bad. And maybe it's not wrong, but it is. We know what is right. That is what we are to do. Naturally, people tend to give allegiance to those in authority, and especially those by whom good circumstances have been created. And for example, for children, that would be parents who have given them life. Children begin life by adhering to their parents' orders and guidance. Think about when you were a child. I know when I was a child growing up, I thought, my dad's the greatest person in the world. He's the strongest person in the world. He can do no wrong. You get older and you realize that's not necessarily the case, but children begin life by adhering to their parents' orders and guidance. Husbands and wives live life adhering to God's orders and guidance. And parents also submit to one another and to their children in seeking what is best for others. So godly submission is cyclic. Paul's instructions here center around the children's responsibility. And this law here is given to children since their parents are the enablers of their existence. They are to obey them. The principle is that they reverence those through whom they exist, in the same way that we as believers reverence the one through whom we exist, that is Jesus Christ. And so the concept is that God is to be obeyed because he is the one through whom both earthly and eternal life exists. God is the creator, and therefore his people need to obey him. Obedience is right because of the Lord's position as creator and life giver. And so the basis for children's obedience follows the same trajectory because it's right to obey the ones who have given life and provided for well-being. In C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, it tells the story of Eustace Scrubb, who turns into a dragon as the result of his greed and his selfishness. And after spending some time as a dragon, Eustace encounters Aslan, who tells him to take off the scales. And then what follows is an excellent illustration of how obedience transforms us, even if it's difficult. Eustace says this. He says, "The lion told me I must undress first." Mind you, I don't know if he said any words out loud or not. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I hadn't any clothes on when I suddenly thought that dragons are snarky sort of things and snakes can cast their skins. Oh, of course, thought I, that's what the lion means. So I started scratching myself and my scales began coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper. And instead of just scales coming off here and there, my whole skin started peeling off beautifully, like it does after an illness, or as if I was a banana. In a minute or two, I just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beside me, looking rather nasty. It was a most lovely feeling. You see, what happens here is Eustace discovers that he has more layers of dragon flesh to peel off, and only Aslan can help him get rid of it all. But Eustace's obedience demonstrates his submission to Aslan's plan. And similarly, we must learn to obey the Lord's command even when the task is quite difficult. Parents are called to obey the Lord in bringing up children. Children are called to obey parents as to the Lord. So the underlying motivation for children's obedience to their parents is the fact that it is right. Parental responsibilities involve ensuring their children become productive adults. Parents hold the greatest level of accountability here. Children are not handed off to the government. The responsibility of raising and even educating children, that is the responsibility of parents, not the responsibility of the government. Children may not understand the reasons behind parental controls and demands, but without question, children should obey their parents. And as I mentioned earlier, obedience becomes disparate as children grow until they can make mature adult decisions. Until then, though, obedience is how children do what is right. And it appears as though many believers exclude the religious aspect of the Christian faith. For example, many assume that Christianity is a relationship with no religious aspect to it. But James makes it clear that there's a difference between pure and defiled religion in James 1:27. In other words, religion is necessary, but it must be pure rather than defiled. And so when I talk about obedience, there is a religious aspect to our faith. When I talk about sometimes doing what we don't necessarily want to do, if it is right, we must do it. It is an obligation. There is a religious aspect to our faith. And so whether this is realized or not, the religious aspect of the Christian faith requires doing what is right. Whether it's enjoyed or not, or whether agreed or not, Christians are beckoned to live life according to what is right. Children, likewise, are to obey parents because it is right. The motivation for obedience is based on its rightness. And so Paul's focus here is children in perhaps the simplest of grounds between members of the family unit. Children are commanded to obey, and they must do so simply because it is right. So that is the motivation for obedience. It is right. Next truth from this text: honor is primary. So the next verses 2 and 3, speak of honor. So beyond obedience due to its rightness, children are commanded to honor their fathers and mothers, with a reference to the law's commandment being the first with a promise, namely length of days. In verse 3, it says that you may live long in the land. The Greek word for honor here is timao, which refers to fixing a value. In other words, to honor one's parents is to realize their value through action. One's submission to another, then, is directly related to the realized value he or she, that's the one to whom submission is given, the value that they hold. When Paul calls children to honor their fathers and mothers, he implicitly calls them to realize the inherent value of parents. Now, it might be considered what precisely is meant by the first commandment with a promise. There in verse 2, honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. What is meant by that? Because there is a promise attached to the second commandment, which is not this. Various interpretations exist surrounding this statement. So what exactly does Paul mean here? First, since ancient Jewish culture divided the Ten Commandments into two tables of 5, the reference to the first with a promise could allude to the second table of 5. Another interpretation, however, is that the honoring of the father and mother is the first foundational principle to be learned by children. That is their basic foundational principle that they learn from an early age. And still, a third interpretation is that the fifth commandment here, this is the fifth commandment, to honor the father and mother, is a primary commandment of utmost importance. So maybe that's what Paul meant. In other words, a child's development is founded upon adherence to this particular commandment. And so the essential element in the matter is that honor is primary. Honor is a primary commandment. Neglect of honor toward parents indicates a fault in the godly development of the child. Without honor, the trajectory of the family unit may shift to the point where it's not salvageable. And God has given parents instructions to submit to Him and then to one another, and children the directive to honor their parents. So it is a primary command. Honor is an instruction that really holds no bounds or ending. Now, this is different from obedience, okay? I talked about obedience earlier. The point will come when a child becomes an adult. At that point, obedience is vastly different, but they're still called to honor their parents. Honor changes in its application throughout someone's life, but honor is not ever negated. Since parents are responsible for a child's growth and development into a productive adult, once this point is achieved, honor is not employed as an adult in the same way as it was for a child, because an adult possesses a deeper level of independence, of autonomy, and accountability than a child does. There will come a point when the parents are no longer held accountable for that child's decision because they are no longer a child. An adult is no longer under his or her parents' accountability because he or she is held accountable on their own. As a practical matter, honor at this level is also less attached to obedience. And as difficult as it may be, the time comes in every parent's life when they have to let go of their children. In other words, it's right for parents to give their children that independence. And in these cases, to cling to parental power is wrong. That point will come, and that's difficult for some parents. But the time will come when you must let your child go. Yes, still love them. Yes, still be there for them. But they need to make their own decisions. They need to be held accountable on their own. And so when a child in development is called to obey his or her parents in the Lord throughout development, a child in adulthood is detached from the responsibility of blind obedience. And I'm using the term child here to simply refer to the offspring of parents rather than a human of a certain age. But this type of person, this child, if you will, which is not a child at that point, still needs to honor the father and mother. That is still a command. And again, that's less attached from obedience, but it is still there. Honor is the primary command based upon the God-given position of parents and their role in the development of a child. And this command does not cease with adulthood. Every man and every woman is a son or a daughter of someone. And so the instruction to honor parents continuously applies, although with different applications in adulthood. So for a child to honor his or her father or mother, he or she must realize the value God has assigned to parents, and a value that is inherent because of their responsibility and position as parents. And failure to understand this value likely results in a failure of obedience and honor, and therefore the beginnings of the family breakdown. But for this honor and obedience to occur, parents need to employ submission first to God and then to each other. All parties act on the basis that it is right to do so and proceed from there as to the Lord. Keep in mind, everything stems from as to the Lord. Every family action should spring from submission to the Lord, because everything the believer does should be done as to him. And so for a child to honor his or her parents is to honor God. Honor is primary. So in these instructions here, the first 2 points of motivation for obedience is the fact that it is right. Second point, honor is primary. And thirdly, what Paul talks about here is authority. It brings up rather than down. In verse 4, he says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." As is the case in mutual submission, not all responsibility lies on one side. And so Paul finally directs the highest form of authority in the family towards fathers, although mothers could certainly be included in this address, especially in circumstances where the father is not present. Paul likely had both parents in mind when he used the word fathers. The point, however, is that parents are responsible for their children and need to consider their job as authorities crucial to their children's proper development and spiritual growth. So, again, all parties hold some level of accountability. So yes, he's given instructions to children, but it ultimately falls back on the parents. And so the Apostle Paul emphatically instructs fathers not to provoke children to anger. The word used for provoke here is parorgizo, and it's employed and also in chapter 4, verse 21, and in Romans 10:19, and it's quoting Deuteronomy 32:21 in that circumstance. And it's right for parents to demand obedience, but there needs to be a capricious exercise of authority. Discipline is essential in the home, but not unnecessary rules and regulations and endless petty correction by which children are discouraged. So there is a proper way to handle this. So the overarching concept of parental responsibility here is to bring up a child. And any neglect of submission to the Lord or mutual submission to one spouse spawns a propensity to bringing down the child rather than bringing him up. So the task of bringing up is clearly placed on parents. Moreover, Paul clarifies that children are brought up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Okay, so he doesn't just say bring up the child, he says bring them up in the Lord. So the Apostle Paul's words point to a directive where parents hold the most responsibility in the development of children, but not merely development that will make them successful in the eyes of the world, but in a way that honors God. So if a child becomes an adult with numerous academic and athletic awards, but abandons the faith in God, their achievements are futile and wasted. I know parents spend so much time putting their kids in club sports and academic. Listen, your child is not going to go anywhere. I promise you that. And so it's good to achieve greatness in everything someone does, but if parents don't bring their children up in the ways of the Lord, and it results in a child who becomes an adult without a faith in God, those parents have failed in their responsibility. In a society where the world demands so much of families and children, and let's be honest, it's getting busier and busier and crazier. Be sure that your focus is on the Lord, that your child is being brought up in the ways of the Lord, that is primary, that is the focus. Because if they think anything else is more important, it's a failure. And parents should demand more in the way of holiness. Parents should demand more in the way of godliness. And parents should set an inarguable example for their children that the most important element in life is to honor God. And anything else is but rubbish when set against it. So the specific instruction given by Paul is to avoid provocation. The godly way to bring up a child is to model Christ-like humility. Jesus led by example in humility and gentleness. And this is not to suggest that a stern response is not ever necessary, because even Jesus was stern at times. For example, the turning of the temple tables. But what this is to suggest is that a firmly gentle approach with the goal of bringing up a child is the correct approach. So bringing up a child must be intentional. Without intentionality, the child will be brought down. In other words, fall away from the truth of God. And so parents need to deliberate in how their children are approached. Be intentional about it. While children have the responsibility to obey their parents and parents discipline their children, everything must be done in love, because in love is the manner God leads and disciplines his own people. When we are disciplined by God, it is in love. And with Jesus as the authoritative example of leadership, parents should seek approaches in their children's development that point them to him rather than away from him. Paul's instructions are not simply to bring up children, because just stopping there is an exercise in futility, but to do so in the ways of the Lord. Anything less is wasted. Parents exist as the primary authority for children. And although one's primary authority shifts throughout the course of life, until a child is an independent adult, his or her parents are authoritative. And parents hold power because of their position, which is the ability to force or coerce someone to do your will. Okay? So let's be honest, there are people in the world that hold power because of the position they're in. Doesn't mean they're respected, but because of the position they're in, they have power. And so children should obey their parents based on that paternal power. But godly parental leadership also elicits authority, which is the skill of getting people to willingly do your will because of your personal influence. Jesus revealed authority and educed people's willingness to follow him. His followers did not question his intent or motivation because Jesus held their best interest in his heart and mind. And the model for parental leadership, parents should have their children in such a way that their motivation is never questioned, even when there exists tension or disagreements, which that's going to happen. That happens in all relationships, but particularly those between parents and children. And so when Paul clearly gives children the charge to obey and honor their parents, beginning with the father, have a greater responsibility to bring up their children in honoring and obeying the Lord. Children are to honor their parents as to the Lord, which is derived from parents bringing up their children as to the Lord. Godly family dynamics here hinge on doing everything as to the Lord. So in this discussion of children and the family dynamics, we need to realize that number one, the motivation for obedience is the fact that it is right. Number two, honor is primary. Children are to honor their parents. Believers are to honor each other. And then number three, authority brings up, not down. Even as adults, we have authorities in our life. And the way we know they're an authority is they're bringing us up. Otherwise, they just hold power, and that's it. So, doing what is right requires toil. That's something people don't want to talk about the Christian life. The toil of the Christian life. An aspect of the faith many Christians fail to understand is the required toil. Believers are called to work out salvation with fear and trembling. Does that sound like something that's easy? It's not. It requires toil. It requires work. And so this means that the Christian life is not a piece of cake, but demands toil and strife. And when confronted with sin, Christians are to make war, not passively onlook. In family dynamics, submission and obedience requires work, but it's necessary on the solid foundation that it is right. Christians obey God because it is right, and doing so reflects His character. And so children are to likewise obey parents because it's right. And so in these few verses, Paul gives instructions to children regarding the obedience and honor of their parents, but he also gives instructions to the parents in how to bring up their children with an understanding that the child's development is the direct obligation of parents. Education is a parental responsibility, not a government responsibility. In all facets of family dynamics, toil is required, and Christians should approach these relationships with the expectation of intentional work. But this toil is employed as to the Lord. When the Lord is the motivation for what's done, duty is overtaken by inspiration. And we might find it difficult to submit to one another, especially other humans, but to the Lord, that shouldn't be an issue. In other words, would you rather submit to the Lord or would you rather submit to another person? Well, our submission to other people stems from our submission to the Lord, so that is ultimate. The toil of submission is real, but its advantages exceed its difficulty. And all family dynamics are based upon mutual submission to God and then to each other. And so families should toil together knowing that their endeavors are to the Lord and not to humankind. So that concludes this 4-part series on marriage and specifically on the family unit and submitting to one another. Keep in mind that everything here is founded upon the fact that we do all we do to the glory of God. We do it as to the Lord. I hope this has been beneficial to you. I hope this has given you some information you can think about and that you can use in your daily Christian life to become a better worshiper of God through this. We are called to submit to one another in love and in kindness. And as we submit to God, we submit to one another. And so this is the foundation. This is the foundation of marriage. We do everything we do in all of life, but especially those who are married, as to the Lord. So I hope this has been beneficial to you and helped you in many ways. And so I do want to thank you for listening to these podcast episodes and this entire series on marriage. So thank you for listening today to the Act of Worship podcast. This is Dr. Jonathan Michael Jones.